It's a famous example of, you can't get much more compressed than this, and it's a very lovely example. So Hemingway's 6-word novel.
Jonathan, can you provide insights into the structure of a short story and how it differs from other forms of storytelling, such as novels or novellas?
Sure. Well, one thing that I think is somewhat different about a short story versus longer forms is I think that the writer has to start making choices a little bit earlier on in terms of what the story is going to be about. I think with a longer work, you have a little more time to sort of set things out at the beginning, to handle the setting, to, do some history of a town. Like these kinds of things, you have a little more flexibility. Since you have a little bit more space, you can do those kinds of things. Whereas with a short story, as we saw when I showed you the Mona Simpson, the Lorrie Moore, and the Ernest Hemingway stories, each of those stories gets to be what it is, and what it's going to become very quickly. Like dramatic action, significant internal thought, dialogue, moving right into what is important, what is significant, right? Because there's almost like a relationship between the reader and the writer. And the reader is saying, okay, writer, I will pay close attention to your story, and in return, I expect you to only tell me what is important and what is essential and what is meaningful. And if you start straying too far from that and showing me stuff that's not that important, I'm going to lose faith in you and I may quit reading your story. So with a short story, there's just no time to waste. I mean, first paragraphs are enormously important. And that's when you're beginning to create the arena of where the action is going to take place and how it's going to take place. For example, is this during COVID times? Like, that's a very important part of the Lorrie Moore story. So she establishes right away, these are the times that the characters are living in. And all of this kind of information gets transmitted to us like within 50 words, a small number of words.
Sure. With the Mona Simpson character, forgive me, I don't remember, was the gender reveal? Because I was thinking it was a female.
But it is a female, yeah.
Okay, I'm picturing someone that's maybe a middle class, upper middle class, who doesn't need these items, but there is a thrill that they get. And we've all heard of people that have done this in the past. And there's just something about the fact that they're able to get away with that just, it's like a drug to them.
Yeah, exactly. And you got that without her telling you that. She showed you based on how the character uses language, that she may be from a certain class background. She may be of a certain age. She may have a certain race, ethnicity, national background. I mean, this is another thing that stories need to accomplish very quickly, is this kind of information, because you're now starting to create all of these mental images of who this character is based on the way she uses words, the way she perceives the world, the way she thinks about herself, the way she thinks about the past. I mean, so much gets transmitted in those ways. Yeah. She doesn't sit down and say, reader, I'm an upper middle class girl from X place, or, so on. It just gets transmitted through her use of language.
Sure.
Yeah.
Jonathan, how should writers approach character development in a short story, considering the limited time they have to explore backgrounds and motivations?
Yeah, this is an important question. And I think every short story writer asks him or herself that question throughout the time throughout the years, really, because it's always important. One thing that writers do, and that I sometimes do as well, is keep character journals. And character journals they can just be lists of qualities that the character has, things that the character has done, and it can also just sort of be a timeline of important events. So what year was the character born? What year did they marry? What were the significant events? When did the character leave home? Whatever it is that's important in the story, to sort of keep track of when it happened and when it happened in relationship to other things is really important in terms of keeping things really tight, compressed, because you're trying to choose, the timeline of events that are important events. Another way of thinking about this question is, sometimes if I want a very sort of brief thumbnail kind of description of what a story is, or even almost a definition of what it is, I sometimes talk about stories as mapping a process of meaningful change. So I think if there's no change in a story, readers might say, well, this didn't go anywhere, or this didn't sort of pay off. But I don't think you want to telegraph the changes in the character either. So I think one thing that you have to decide when writing a short story is, like, whatever event A is, like whatever sort of the most important earliest event is, how does that event or line of dialogue or whatever it is, how does it begin the process of change that will ultimately be what the story is about? And how do you do that? And the answer is, you may need an entire draft to figure that out. You may not know that when you first sit down to write the story. But if you're thinking in terms of the things I've talked about already, is this believable? Is this motivated? And is this complex? Then I think eventually you'll arrive at, the process of meaningful change that the story ends up mapping.
How does the opening of a short story differ from a longer form story?
I personally really tend to respond to stories that have urgency at the beginning. Like, you don't know how urgent. First of all, if you call a story The Killers, it already creates urgency, because we're starting to wonder who the killers are, who they're going to kill. Have they already killed people? The kinds of high stakes questions that we're asking happen just from the title. And then from the first two sentences, here they come into the lunch counter, here they're sitting down. Now they're, not taking off their overcoats and their gloves. Like, this is creating a sense of urgency in the reader, a sense of, I have to know what's going to happen next. It's firing those, firing our imagination and setting up the stakes. Like, is someone going to get his heart hurt? Or, whatever the stakes of the story are, life and death in the case of that one, you begin to set that up at the beginning of a short story. But you can also do that with a longer form story too. I just think the sense of urgency is important, but you can take perhaps a little longer to articulate what that urgency is.
Okay, maybe you can help me workshop something just real quick. So if I was going to come up with, let's say, a CEO, and this guy's almost superhuman, and maybe kind of just open it up with, he always got what he wanted. I don't know. I don't have this fleshed out, but just I'm painting a picture of someone he's 10 steps ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
And it's true. He never touches failure. And I think that he seems like this sort of Superman.
Right.
hearing the word no was like a chess game to him. I don't know.
Right,
Just
right.
something.
Yeah.
So I'm using little short bursts
Right.
to describe this man
Yeah.
who's charismatic, but also underneath it all a shark.
Right.
They're very strategic in how they play their cards.
Right. Well, one way to approach a story like that is to just put him into action being a shark. Like, instead of explaining to the reader, this is what kind of person he is, like, show him doing shark-like things, like show him taking advantage of people, show him feeling invulnerable. Like, I think, fiction, and short fiction in particular, convinces through the senses. Like, if you want a reader to remember and be able to sensorily experience a story, you have to provide sensory detail, things that the character sees, smells, touches, tastes, and hears. And once you're sort of engaging the senses, then the story can take up ideas a little bit more. But I think ultimately it's, dramatic action, dialogue, some thought are best to use when possible. And, if explanation or summary is helpful in certain parts of the story, then yeah, use that. But I jump into action with, especially someone who's behaving the way he is. That's a fascinating character. And also, there's a part of me that thinks, well, if he doesn't really contemplate failure, it would be interesting to put him in a situation where he might actually fail. And if he fails, there may be consequences that are going to be difficult for him to deal with. We were just talking about sort of short, all fiction has to be compressed. All details have to be significant. Art is selective, and you have to select details that are going to add up to meaning in the reader's experience. But thinking of Hemingway and how good he was at that, particularly in his stories from his 20s, it's a famous example of, you can't get much more compressed than this, and it's a very lovely example. So Hemingway's 6-word novel, For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. No comment beyond that.
Okay.
That's like that.
Yeah.
That
Wow.
kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah, because you think, and then it takes you down.
Exactly.
Then you just, wow. Yeah.
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 You could write a novel